If you've been to any of our sessions before, you know we like to call out the names of some of the people you are in community with at our events, even if you can't see them on Zoom. If we have time, we'll try to call out people before each session. We're pleased to welcome several of our conference leadership benefactors, Arrow Auduro, Ari Giovenco, and Nate Giordano with Amazon, Jade Willanen and the team at Trade Data Monitor, Dante Smalls and his colleagues at UPS, and Maria Ziba and our friends at the National Pork Producers Council. Thank you to Amazon, TDM, UPS, and the National Pork Producers Council for your support for WITA and the conference. We are very grateful to all of you. And thanks, of course, to all of you for joining us. If you've registered to attend the conference, you should have received a link to our conference program by email this afternoon, and that contains bios of each of our speakers, so we can dispense with lengthy introductions. And with that, I'd like to call our first panel onto the screen. David Lynch is the global economics correspondent with the Washington Post. Doug Palmer is the senior trade reporter at Politico. Anna Swanson is the trade and international economics reporter at the New York Times. David, Doug, and Anna are well known to many of you, and we're delighted to have you with us today. We're also pleased to welcome WITA's newest partner, Iana Dreyer, the founder and editor of Borderlex. It's a pleasure to have you with us, Iana. And our moderator, Everett Eissenstat, a partner at the Public Policy Practice Group at Squire, Patton, Boggs, and someone well known to everyone in the WITA community for his long service to our country, including as the Deputy Assistant to the President for International Economic Affairs and Deputy Director of the National Economic Council in the first Trump administration. And of course, a one-time WITA board member. We're delighted to welcome all of you here today. Everett?
Fantastic, Ken. Thank you so much. And it's a real honor for me to have the opportunity to moderate such an esteemed panel. I've known many of these names since I was just a young trade legislative assistant and really influenced by a lot of their writing. So it's a real pleasure to be with this group. We are going to set the scene for what is going to be a fantastic conference. Ken has really, again, put together a great program. We've got a lot to cover, so we're going to try to get through as much as we can in the 45 minutes that we have. I'm going to start with just a general question I'd like to ask each of you, and we'll start first with Anna, and then go to David, Doug, and then Iana. The question I'd like to ask, I believe we all went through the first Trump administration. I know I certainly did. We're all here today, and we're back at the second Trump administration. We are 21 days into that second term. And I'd like to ask, starting with Anna, what has surprised you the most about the first 21 days of this second Trump administration?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really delighted to be here with all of you. Love WITA events, and this is no exception. So, many of you have been on this wild ride with me, so you'll know what I'm talking about. But I think what has been most notable for me is kind of the whiplash effect that we have seen between the day one trade moves with the Trump administration and then what has happened in week 2 and 3 of trade news. So day one was actually relatively subdued on the trade front. The president signed an executive order that requested reports on about 24 different trade issues. And so to me, that, potentially pointed to what I thought was, teeing up more strategic, perhaps still very broad, very impactful trade policies, and perhaps something that would ultimately be even more influential, where these reports would mean that the president would have more legal justification for the tariffs he was going to pursue, but overall kind of more of a paced and strategic approach to trade. But what we've seen in the days since then, that the president is not waiting for these careful reports, that he's really gone back to trusting, his own impulses, his own policy on what he sees as a signature issue, trade. So that since then, we've seen the president go ahead with threatening or moving ahead with tariffs on many of the very topics that he commissioned reports on, including trade deficits, fentanyl, de minimis, reciprocal trade. So, along with others, I had been anticipating that this next term might lead to the president amping up some of his trade actions. If you remember, his first term, 2018, was actually, or I'm sorry, am I thinking 2016 was actually the initial year was actually relatively quiet. And it took a while for him to ramp up to putting tariffs on what was ultimately hundreds of billions of dollars of products. But in just the last, few weeks, we have seen the president talk about tariffs on more than $1.3 trillion of products. So it certainly seems like that, trajectory is increasing even more so than many of us thought. And it's such a sharp contrast from the Biden administration where, tariffs on China were formulated really over the course of years to now we're shifting back to what seems like a matter of just days. Thanks.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And I'm going to turn to David here, but just to opine on that, it was a year actually. It was almost a year before tariffs went into effect, and much more incremental, much more measured. And now we've got a more dynamic, as you say, whiplash type dynamic, and it's definitely something that is different. So thank you for that, David. You're on mute, sir.
There we go. So I'm surprised or was surprised by a couple of things. One, just the sheer pace of events right out of the gate. There was, with the exception of, as Anna says, a little bit of a slow first day. He's been firing all barrels blazing ever since. I mean, it's literally every day he says something about tariffs or does something about tariffs. And I found that surprising, also in the sense that he's done a lot even before Jamison Greer, his chief negotiator, has been confirmed, before his Commerce Secretary, who is ostensibly supposed to have purview, the trade portfolio was confirmed. So a lot of activity right out of the gate, and none of it or very little of it really spoke directly to the two principal proposals that he had campaigned on, the tariffs of up to 60% on Chinese goods and a universal tariff of 10 to 20% on all 3 trillion in imports. I think we're certainly still headed there. And I think that's presumably what all the studies that are due in April, pardon me, will lead us to. But I would not have guessed if we had been having this conversation on January 19th, I would not have guessed that our North American neighbors would have been the first tariff targets right out of the gate, and that the tariffs would have been announced, threatened, imposed, and then paused related to illegal immigration and fentanyl. So I think that it's going to be a wild ride, and this is, despite how active and how fatiguing it might feel to those of us trying to keep up, I think this is just the overture. There's a lot more to come.
Yeah, I think you're right, David. And just, recall that even prior to Mexico and Canada, we actually did put out an executive order. There was the Colombia weekend, and that's something seems like a long time ago, but that was also quite a dramatic 24, 48 hours. Let's turn to Doug Palmer.
Yeah, well, I would echo a lot of what David and Anna had said. In terms of something that really surprised me, I guess, was his decision to go after USAID. I mean, that wasn't something that I recall being mentioned during the campaign. He may have talked about it and I missed it, but I'm not surprised he's hostile to foreign aid, but I just didn't expect he would try to shut down that agency. But more generally, just the totality of his actions and his expansive view of executive powers, his continued willingness to break norms and see what he can get away with. That's not a total surprise, but it's still a little astonishing to watch. And I guess I'm surprised that there hasn't been a lawsuit yet against his, to challenge his use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Acts to expand tariffs on China. I mean, maybe people are waiting for him to use IEPA on Canada and Mexico before they go forward. But it seems like the use of that against China already sets a precedent. And then I don't know, I wasn't familiar with these people that he's bringing into the administration. I mean, Jameson, I've had the chance to get to know a little bit over the years, but I didn't know anything about Scott Bessent and Howard Lutnick. Listening to some of Howard Lutnick's, interviews and podcasts, I was kind of surprised how much he sort of echoes what Trump says on tariffs. How he seems to have the same worldview. That's just surprising to me from somebody from Wall Street. And he talks about this whole idea of making countries pay to access the US market. We have such a big market, they should pay us in order to have the privilege of selling here. And that's just kind of like, I'm not an economist, but I did take economics in college, and that just seems like a pretty surprising approach for an economic official, a US economic official to have.
Yeah, it's almost like there's a tariff test that you had to go through to get into the
Right.
administration. That was a little bit different than the first term for sure. And
Mm.
just remind folks, IEEPA is a pretty broad statute used for sanctions primarily, not used for tariffs before. So your point about a lawsuit not being filed, I think that's a good, astute observation. We could probably expect that coming down the pike, but we will have to wait and see in which case will be brought. Let's turn to Iana. What surprised you the most from the European Union perspective?
Thank you very much. I think what surprised Europeans most, and including myself, is the territorial issue linkage. Greenland, but also, the threat, more or less indirect, tied to also the tariff question to Canada of, incorporating potentially Canada into the US. So that one was really a surprise. And I must say it is, really scary seen from outside, especially from an allied continent. So that one was really the big surprise. The other surprise was that actually the EU, for example, was not targeted first. It was first Colombia, and given that we've experienced Trump's obsession in the first term with German cars and all these things, that the EU, the first, until recently, was not so much on the president's radar. So that probably brought us false sense of relief to Europe. We think I do think that it's coming. So that was the other surprising factor, especially when you compare with Trump 1. And also the other surprising factor as well is that the World Trade Organization doesn't seem to be on the very top of his list of bad guys. Other international organizations are. The WTO, we don't know if it's going to survive Trump, but and I know the Secretariat are trying to keep very quiet and keep a low profile at the moment before the storm hits.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I mean, there were a lot of other organizations that he targeted right out of the box there, including WHO and now USAID, US organizations. But the WTO, maybe this will spur some action in this conversation. We'll have to wait and see. But
yeah, we shouldn't give him bad ideas.
Definitely. Well, I think one thing is certain, there's a lot of surprises, and it's only been 21 days. So let's step back and try to put this in a broader context. Anna has covered trade and economics and really the economics of trade for many, many years. And I'd like to get your perspective. There's so much more even beyond tariffs that's really become part of the trade lexicon. Everything from export control, supply chains, industrial policy, and really moving away from trade integration and trade towards a concept that is a word used frequently, two words, economic security. And I wonder from your perspective, if you could give us some sense of how this administration may be bringing all those tools to bear. Will there be a recalibration between export controls and trade? Or how do you see this evolving? I know it's still early in the administration, but I think your experience would be very helpful in setting the stage here.
Yeah, thank you. It's a really fascinating question. So I was actually, thinking back to the first Trump term and realizing that, there are some issues when it comes to this issue of economic security, national security, that I think the Trump team is now kind of vindicated on, right? Because they, were pretty early in adopting this perspective that, more things should fit under the umbrella of national security than most of the trade community would think, and initially received a lot of criticism about that. Think what you want about their proposal for a Section 232 investigation into automobiles, but initially that was quite controversial. Fast forward to today, I think it's a lot more accepted that people see the U.S. auto industry as a strategic part of the U.S. economy, just very important in terms of job growth. But we also have protections now for connected cars, and are thinking of all these other kind of security dimensions of economics that we hadn't seen before. So I do think that they were sort of early to grab onto that. Probably some of that is still quite controversial in terms of, is some of this just protectionism in the guise of national security? When can you, how can you judge when it's simply a domestic industry that's clamoring for protection rather than a legitimate national security need? And those are really important questions. But I do think, throughout the Biden administration and the first Trump administration, you did see increasing use of export control tools, use of the entity list, adoption of provisions, looking at connected technologies, expanded use of CFIUS. And so my view is that, this is very much kind of the direction that the machinery of government, whether it's Congress or both parties, is rolling towards, that this is really the direction of government. I think a little bit the wild card in the situation is what President Trump himself thinks about it, because it doesn't seem to me from, my interviews and my understanding that he has a very, strong philosophical stance on some issues like export controls or CFIUS reviews, that compared to some of his advisors who might be, you might think of as sort of China hawks or trade protectionists, he does view it a little more as a source of leverage, as, something that at the end of the day, he just wants to strike kind of the best deal for the United States on the whole, and, doesn't have sort of as strong of an approach one way or the other when it comes to, shutting down, for example, shipments of technology to China or blocking Chinese investment from the United States. So I am interested to see how that dynamic plays out. But certainly the general trend is definitely more towards economic security as national security.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really entrenched now. We even see other governments are now using the terms, and for some of their governance models, this idea of economic security is really embedded, but nobody quite knows the parameters of it. And like, where does that extend, as you say? And it could be very far, it could be narrowly defined, and we have to see how it works in this administration. I do want to encourage anyone if anyone from the panel wants to weigh in, please just unmute your mic. We'd love to have a conversation. I've got a lot of questions lined up, but please feel free to weigh in on something that you feel you can contribute to. I'm sure we'd all love to hear the different perspectives. Let me turn to you, David, and let's talk a little bit about tariffs and the president's campaign promises. So he campaigned on a number of tariff models, and he gave a lot of justifications for tariffs, everything from reducing the trade deficit to curing unfair trading practices, and now we've even heard about it in the context of perhaps raising revenue to pay for tax cuts, and these are really all very, very different. So from your perspective, and someone who's been watching trade policy evolve in the U.S. for quite some time, where is this all going? Are these leverage? Are they negotiating tactics? Can you peer into your crystal ball and give us a sense of where do you think this lands? What ultimately is going to be the outlook here for the U.S. tariff agenda?
My crystal ball has been of little help for the last 8 or 9 years, but I'll take one more look into it and see if it will serve me better this time. I think what's always among the things that have always been interesting to me about President Trump's approach to trade and tariffs is that there is always a tension between different strands of his policies. The desire to shrink the trade deficit on the one hand, and yet the desire to put more money into people's pockets via tax cuts on the other. Those two planks work at cross purposes. They worked at cross purposes in the first term. They're going to do that again in the second term, and he's perfectly comfortable with that. So the idea that he has multiple objectives for tariffs is not surprising in that context. I don't know if it's going to be as easy to maintain that tension or that multiplicity of objectives over the duration of the second term, because at some point, you can either use, or rather it will be, I think, difficult to continue to use tariffs as a weapon, as a club to compel other countries to do something that we desire, and then remove the tariff when they've cooperated to whatever degree. That sort of temporary short-termism of the tariff weapon. How do you maintain that if you really want to secure an adequate amount of revenue going forward to offset the impact of some of the tax cuts? And he seems very serious about that. I think many economists would say there's just no way you're going to be able to replace the income tax, which is applied on perhaps $20 trillion worth of taxable income, with another tax, which is what the tariff is, on $3 trillion worth of taxable goods. That's just not going to add up. So I think watching how that plays out is going to be a fascinating and important element of the story.
No, it's a good point, and yeah, I'm not great at math, but I can see those don't match. So yeah, there's a gap to be made up there, and it's fascinating because this reconciliation process and the tax cuts is right around the corner here, and one of the tension points is, can you use tariffs for revenue in that context? And there's a school, I think most people believe you cannot unless you statutorily increase those revenues. And if you do that, then you can't withdraw them so readily. To your point, it's hard to negotiate with something that's in a statute that you have to go back to Congress and then redo. So we'll see. But it's going to be a very very interesting few months for sure. Doug, let me turn to you. You've been watching Congress and trade for many, many years, and I think one of the questions that I get frequently is who's in charge. We have a number of factors here. We've got the Assistant to the President, Peter Navarro, who's been a long stalwart in the Trump administration. Of course, Jamieson Greer, whose confirmation hearing was last week, and then Howard Lutnick, who was appointed to be the trade voice even prior to his confirmation. So we've seen this a bit before in the past, but what is your observation on where the real we know in the first term that it was Ambassador Lighthizer was clearly part of the intellectual foundation of President Trump's policies. Who is playing that role here, and who do you think is most persuasive in this administration?
Well, I think it remains to be seen. I mean, I think Trump is the guy who's truly in charge and has the last word on all of this. But when he nominated Howard Lutnick, he did say that Mr. Lutnick was going to be in charge of trade and tariff policy, within the administration. And since then, there's been some clarification with Lutnick saying that, USTR retains its, statutory responsibility over trade negotiations, et cetera, and Greer sort of defending that responsibility before the Finance Committee. I personally think that Lutnick has a closer relationship with Trump than Jamieson Greer does. That's just based on my observation, and that maybe that might make him more influential in that regard. But Lighthizer's initially people were saying that Wilbur Ross, as Commerce Secretary, was going to be in charge of trade in the first administration, and it wasn't until Wilbur Ross struck this 100-day deal with China that, he heralded it as a miraculous achievement, and other people were like, this is like warmed over S&ED commitments. That his star kind of fell, and that Lighthizer sort of like emerged as the man who really knew how to do this. Was going to went to the president and said, let's do this Section 301 investigation. So it took a while, mainly because of a lag in the confirmation process, for Lighthizer just kind of emerge as the main voice on trade within the administration. And whether that's the same with Jameson, I don't know. I mean, Jameson seems like a very competent individual. I just don't know if he has the same forceful personality that Lighthizer has, and that made him so effective.
Yeah, it's fascinating. We've seen this movie before. I mean, all the way back to Reagan and then Obama, this idea of reorienting or aligning the trade functions under commerce, yet it never really happens. And
Right.
a really interesting narrative, but we'll see. This administration may be different. So we'll have to watch that very carefully. So Iana, you are going to get the tough questions. Now we've gone through the easy ones, but so we've got a president who likes to deal with individual member states. We've got an institution in the European Union that has mandated competency over trade. I know there's some anti-coercion policies in place. I think the European Union is prepared to react. Do you think the European Union is positioned well to engage in the Trump administration style, which is very transactional and somewhat trying to play states off each other? How do you see the institutions managing that tension?
Well, thank you very much. Obviously, the institutional setup is not very conducive to a Canada-style direct transaction via tweets, Prime Minister telling Trump we're going to resist and things like that. So, but that inertia we have in the system actually sometimes also helps the EU. That's a little bit my argument in there. I mean, in terms of the response possibilities, the EU has many of them. I went over them actually this weekend in detail. We've heard a lot of it is there because we had a first administration. So there's a lot of legislation out there that could be used against the US if really the going gets tough in the coming years. I mean, we have 4 years ahead of us. Obviously, we have also tariffs that are built into potentially snap back. We had this tariff truce that was negotiated with the Biden administration on the Section 232 steel and aluminum tariffs. The EU very strategically put its end of the truce at the end of March, and it needs a positive decision by member states to postpone it. So whatever comes out of this announcement on steel and aluminum might almost automatically, in this very bureaucratic fashion, lead to some haggling or need to engage also on the US side with the EU, to avert retaliatory tariffs or whatever. So something could start very quickly. There's the anti-coercion instrument. This one is probably really thought of as an instrument of last resort that is really probably only used for really heavy duty items. For if the territorial question with Greenland appears, it might be an obvious candidate to use the anti-coercion instrument. There we don't know how individual member states will react because national security is still a national prerogative in the EU, contrary to trade, but there is this issue linkage. And obviously member states will want to, most member states will want to act together, but can they put something together quickly and decisively is an open question. But in the meantime, there are all these little things that can snap back. Airbus, Boeing tariffs, they could snap back in next year if things go wrong. So there is inertia, but that inertia in many ways has also inbuilt automatic deadlines that mean that you still need a negotiation. And, it's not the first time that the Commission has negotiated with the Trump administration. So they'll probably figure things out a lot, as things come. There's a lot of uncertainty about how exactly what tariffs how exactly and which framework, how they will come, but people know it will come, and they will figure things out one way or the other. What is notable, however, that the EU doesn't want to inflame the president. It was very striking. The first reaction was, oh, if you do that to us, you get struck back. There is really an attempt for the moment to remind the entire US administration of the importance of the transatlantic economic relationship and of the alliance, because the real question, the real fundamental perceived threat is on the security architecture of the EU, this linkage with NATO. And that is more difficult, but it's more long term.
Yeah, those are really excellent points, and it points to one of the I guess really difficult things to square the circle on. Is one of the issues with the European Union is NATO security, and as you noted, the competencies for national security rest with the member states. Yet he likes to meld it all together. It goes back to the concept we talked about with Anna on economic security. And it's hard to bring that all to bear, but you're right. There is a mechanism to do that. It's going to be incredible to watch this transpire and what it does for the institutional mechanism as well. I'm going to open up please, Iana, please.
Yeah. The EU itself has developed an economic security strategy in 2023. It's a communication, so it's more sort of a plan of action. So there is already a lot of delegating on behalf of from the member states to the EU on security issues, because obviously the US is not the main question. I mean, it's a threat because this is the pillar of the security system in the EU. But obviously we've had the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Chinese support for Russia, that is really changing the ballgame in Europe. So I mean, there is increasingly blurred lines between some of the national security and the EU-wide security issues. It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out with the Trump administration.
Yeah, totally agree. And I think another interesting dynamic is we've had this conversation now for almost 30 minutes. We haven't talked about Congress, and as many of our listeners probably know, Congress tariff authority under the U.S. Constitution rests with the Congress. Yet here we're talking about the administration and its use of statutory authority. I know many trade lawyers are now looking at dusting off old statutes from the 1930s. What is the extent of these? Having worked in Congress, I know that it's been a long time since we passed trade legislation. I say we, I mean the Congress. I think 2015 was the last big bill, and there's a lot of stuff pending. So I'd like to just open it up to the team, the group here, and for anyone to answer, what about the role of Congress? Do you see Congress being more assertive, and is there a possibility that some trade legislation may be evolving out of all this? Doug?
I don't know. That's a really good question. I mean, at Jamison Greer's hearing last week, Senators Wyden and Cantwell were pretty outspoken about their concern over a universal tariff. I mean, maybe that's not the way that Trump is going to go anymore, since he's been talking about this reciprocal tariff idea. But the Republicans, for the most part, if they didn't offer outright support for the tariffs, they were more likely to, express concern about the potential for retaliation than to say that, this is a stupid idea, we shouldn't be doing it at all. So I don't know. I mean, if he were to go forward with a universal tariff and we were to and we started to see a lot of negative consequences about that, maybe Congress would, muster enough votes to do something about it. But they didn't do much, to rein him in during his first term, and I haven't seen much evidence so far that they intended to do it in the second term. So we'll see.
Yeah, and it's interesting because some of the things that the president wants to do, I mean, IEEPA is a broad statute. You noted that it could be subject to litigation. But there's also, the USMCA renegotiations, potential for other trade agreement, revamping. And I think you can do that, but there is an extent. The USMCA with the NAFTA was renegotiated using congressionally delegated authority that has expired. So if he goes too deep into USMCA, he may not be able to deliver the negotiation. So that'll be something that we're going to need to watch. We have a question here from the esteemed Grant Eldonis. Those of you who know Grant, he was really one of the great and still great trade expert. He would like to know whether there is any effort, or do you believe that Congress will curtail or otherwise modify the Cold War delegation of authority to the executive on tariffs on statutes like IEEPA? Will Congress reassert that authority?
Yeah, I don't know.
Oh, sorry,
Go
Doug.
ahead, David. No,
No.
go ahead, David. You kind of already
I
said
mean,
it.
I was just gonna, based on no reporting at all, but based
Yeah.
on simply what I've observed in the last 3 weeks, I'd be startled if Congress reasserted its authority on anything. At least, the Republican-led Congress over the next 21 months or so seems pretty clear that they're taking their cue from the White House, and from the person of the president specifically, across the board. Now, I suppose that can always change. We can get into a different environment if we get 6, 9, 12 months down the road, and for whatever reason the economy has slowed beyond what we anticipate today, and unemployment's rising, and it's a different, less hospitable set of circumstances. Then, sure, if people start to holler, then maybe Congress would rediscover its institutional heft. But for the moment, they seem to be on the sidelines cheering him on.
Yeah, and of course, and we'll go to Anna quickly. If the Congress flips in 2 years, we may have a different pushback. Anna?
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree with David. And Doug, it seems, unlikely that you would see a serious challenge from Congress anytime soon. Of course, we'll see what happens with the economics of all these tariffs. I do think the court challenge to an IEEPA-based universal tariff seems like it could be the most sort of interesting and potentially vulnerable ones, because, that might not fit the definition of a national emergency under that statute, or you could argue that point. Unlike something like, the president using IEEPA for these fentanyl situations, maybe that does, fit the definition of a national emergency a bit better than something like trade deficits or unfair trade. So that'll be interesting to watch when and if that happens.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we've got just a few minutes left. And the other thing we've just touched on is China. And obviously, China is a big part of the trade equation. So a little bit, probably a different perspective, maybe from the European Union. I know that there's a big export market there. And then additionally, a lot of more imports, I think, are going into the EU from China. So let's turn to Iana, and then I'll just open it up to the rest of you to comment on, are we going into a decoupling here in the United States, or are we going to end it in some kind of more of a sustained low-level conflict with China on trade? But let's start with Iana from the EU, please.
One of what I found striking in many, for example, of the think tankers in Brussels telling the EU you should do this and that, is to propose, to work with the United States on common concerns related to China, security matters, overcapacities, trade deficit. I mean, the EU's trade deficit with China in goods has increased dramatically. The question is, of course, will such cooperation work, or will the United States not want to work? The EU actually fundamentally, at the moment, I think there is a sense of being squeezed in between two different type of onslaughts. So the EU itself has a decoupling strategy at the moment, which is interesting, with also new developments and new WTO violations in the offing on public procurement, for example, as part of its competitiveness compacts. So there might be a form of friend-foe relationship emerging on the transatlantic front here on issues related to China. That's a very big change compared to the Trump era, or the first years of the Biden administration, where it was the US trying to push the EU into a more defensive and offensive strategy towards China. The EU itself has moved a lot, especially since the war in Russia, where Chinese tacit support seems to be also affecting the security architecture here. On the other hand, nobody really knows how the US administration will work. We had experience with export controls, where the coordination worked very well vis-a-vis Russia under this TTC, Trade and Technology Council. I know the bureaucrats in the commission would love to have a new TTC with the US. I'm not sure it will work. But it was a more difficult conversation on China, where some EU member states felt a bit coerced already by Biden on needing to take decisions on China they didn't want to feel. So it's going to be an interesting game here to watch.
Yeah.
Trilateral.
Absolutely. And I do want to just give everyone, you can vote quickly. I know kids, we're out of time, but if you'd like to just do a vote on decouple or no decouple, please, I'd love to see the hands. David?
I would say full decoupling is not remotely plausible. We're stuck with each other to some degree, maybe a continued erosion, redirection of supply chains at the margin, but not full decoupling.
Anna?
Yeah, I would say, like I said before, the government is sort of headed toward disentangling, but where is the president on it? I think he tries to strike a deal, but a deal also isn't necessarily in contradiction with more decoupling, because if you look at his first trade deal, he struck a deal, but also left tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars of products on China.
Really true. Doug?
Yeah, I would agree. Maybe more managed trade, maybe they would negotiate a voluntary export restraint agreements in certain sectors so that we don't get, too much of a particular product from China, but more, not complete decoupling.
Yeah. Well, this is great. I would just encourage everybody, if you don't follow these trade reporters, you should, because they're all outstanding and they're often have the first and best analysis. So thank you for being on. Ken, I did make it to 145, did not go over. Very proud of that. Thank you for this opportunity. It's been a real honor for me, and I really appreciate it. I think you're going to have a great conference.
Thank you so very much to the 5 of you. Really terrific having you join us for this, and really kicking us off 21 days in.